In Vlog 4, we're going to be covering the idea or the ideals of self and community throughout history, and how ideality still functions today to structure our own becoming. Ideality has always structured the way we think about self and the way we think about our social life. The problem for ideality is that the nature of our self-existence and the nature of our community life or our social life is that both are fundamentally limited and problematic. There are always limitations and there are always problems in relationship to the ideals of a self or a society. And this creates a lot of tension, a lot of suffering, and a lot of pain. The question in philosophy is, to what degree are these ideals of self and these ideals of community universally shared by all selves and all communities throughout time? Or, alternatively, how much do they vary? In another way, we could pose the question of, how natural are the ideals that we pose for self and community? Do they spontaneously arise in our species? Or are they contingent social constructions which can be changed and totally modified? In the larger picture of history, we can also ask the question of whether or not ideals are helpful or harmful for our development. On the one hand, we could tend to think of ideals as helpful because they give us a tool to orient ourselves towards a better state of being. On the other hand, ideals can also be harmful, in the sense that you could posit an ideal which is so different from reality that you end up missing your life or not paying attention to the things that are right in front of you. Ideals can also cause a tremendous amount of catastrophe and devastation. What we can know for sure is, throughout the history of our species, there has always been a gap between ideal and material. In other words, the ideal version of ourself, or the ideal version of our communities, and the actual or material state of ourself and our communities, is always in some sense divided by a difference. In this difference, or in this division, between the ideal and the material, we may say that human beings and human societies have come up with different tools to deal with this difference. Some of these tools may be spiritual practices, like meditation or prayer. Meditation helps one to cope with the uncertainty and unpredictability and some of the problems and limitations of our material reality. And prayer helps us also to close this gap internally to ourselves through discursive practices. We also develop tools such as religion, politics, and morality. Religion and politics in particular form types of institutions of the ideal, trying to build constantly through different rules and different regulations a better and a better state of being for all selves and all human beings. The question on a philosophical level about the nature of history in regards to spirituality, religion, politics, and morality is whether or not this gap internal, or this difference internal to the ideal and the material, is in some sense eternal and unresolvable, meaning that no matter what we do and no matter what actions we undertake, there will always be this difference. From this perspective, the gap between the ideal and the material gives us a clue, potentially, into a really important fundamental structure of reality. Whereas the ideal may posit some completion or some closure, you might think about the ideal spiritual state or the ideal religious state or even the ideal political state as a type of heaven or a type of utopia or a type of full actualization. On the other hand, matter or nature appears to be open and incomplete, meaning that matter or nature is never in a heavenly state or a utopian state. There are always problems and relations which the material world presents to us which, in the moment, appear irresolvable in relationship to our highest ideals. The only way we may be able to get around this, or another way of saying it, a useful way of thinking about this problematic, is to think about the ideal not in terms of a complete closure, like a final utopian climax or a final heavenly resurrection. Instead, thinking about ideals as processes of becoming. In other words, an ideal in the present moment is mediating a particular state of matter and trying to orient it in a better direction. When you think about the ideal as itself open and incomplete, it can lead to an important cognitive shift in the way we relate to these ideals. In essence, what this shift of mind asks of us is to include within our ideals the fact that reality is chaotic and indeterminate, and irreducibly so. There is no way in which an ideal could posit a determinate order which would last forever, an ideal state of being, whether that a political state or a religious state of being. Chaos and indeterminacy are irreducible othernesses, and because of this, ideals must learn how to work within the frame of the problems and limitations which in some sense are generated by the ideal's own positing. In contemporary philosophy, this has led to a large theoretical turn away from a type of Platonic perfectionism and towards forms of epistemological pragmatism. Epistemological pragmatism tries to see things not from the perspective of the transcendental good, true, and beautiful, to use the Platonic terminology, but rather from the good enough, the true enough, and the beautiful enough. In other words, we learn to see the beauty, the truth, and the goodness, inclusive of the limitations and problems presented by our material reality. I hope that this overview of self and community from the perspective of ideality gave you a good introspective look into the nature of the way our ideals have functioned throughout history. Thanks for watching, and thanks for listening.